Marcus Thompson sat quietly in the back corner of the college auditorium, his weathered hands gripping a worn notebook. At 42, he looked older than his years, with gray streaks threading through his dark hair and deep lines etched around his eyes. The scars on his left arm, barely visible beneath his long-sleeved shirt, told stories he rarely shared. The history professor, Dr. Amanda Wells, was discussing modern warfare tactics when a young student raised his hand. "Professor, my dad says most veterans exaggerate their service. How do we know what's real?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had returned to college after 15 years in the military, using his GI benefits to pursue a degree in education. His goal was simple: teach high school history and help young people understand the reality of war, not the Hollywood version. "That's an interesting question, Jake," Dr. Wells replied. "Military service varies greatly. Some soldiers see combat, others serve in support roles. Both are valuable." Jake smirked and glanced around the room. "Yeah, but some guys just claim they were special forces or whatever to impress people. My uncle says you can spot the fakes pretty easily." Marcus felt his jaw tighten. He had heard this conversation countless times since starting college. Young students, barely out of high school, questioning the integrity of men and women who had sacrificed years of their lives in service to their country. After class, Marcus approached Dr. Wells. She was a kind woman in her 50s who had always treated him with respect, unlike some of the younger faculty members who seemed uncomfortable with older students. "Dr. Wells, I was wondering if I could do my final presentation on the psychological impact of combat on soldiers," Marcus said quietly. She looked up from her papers and smiled. "That's a fascinating topic, Marcus. Do you have personal experience with this subject?" Marcus hesitated. He had been careful not to discuss his military background in detail. The last thing he wanted was attention or pity. "I served in Afghanistan. Multiple deployments. What was your role?" she asked with genuine interest. "Special Operations, Delta Force," Marcus replied simply. Dr. Wells's eyes widened slightly. She knew enough about military structure to understand that Delta Force was an elite unit, shrouded in secrecy and composed of the most highly trained soldiers in the military. "That must have been incredibly challenging," she said respectfully. Marcus nodded. "It was. I'd like to help people understand what soldiers really go through, beyond what they see in movies." Over the following weeks, Marcus threw himself into research for his presentation. He spent long hours in the library, reading academic papers about post-traumatic stress, survivor guilt, and the challenges veterans faced when returning to civilian life. He interviewed other veterans on campus, gathering their stories and experiences. His roommate, Tyler, was a 19-year-old business major who had initially been skeptical about living with an older student. However, over time, Tyler had come to respect Marcus for his discipline, work ethic, and quiet wisdom. "Dude, you're like a machine," Tyler said one evening, watching Marcus organize his research materials. "I've never seen anyone work so hard on a single project." Marcus looked up from his laptop. "This matters to me. Too many people have the wrong idea about military service." "What did you do in the Army anyway?" Tyler asked. "You never really talk about it." "I was in the Army for 15 years. Special Operations," Marcus replied, keeping his answer brief as always. Tyler's respect for his roommate grew even more. He had looked up information about Special Operations and understood it wasn't something just anyone could do. As the semester progressed, Marcus noticed increasing tension in his classes. Jake, the student who had questioned veteran integrity, seemed to take every opportunity to make snide comments about military service. During discussions about foreign policy, he would roll his eyes when Marcus offered insights based on his experience overseas. "Easy to play armchair general when you weren't actually there," Jake muttered during one particularly heated class discussion about military strategy. Marcus remained silent, but his hands clenched under his desk. He had learned long ago that engaging with people like Jake rarely led to productive conversations. The breaking point came during a student government meeting that Marcus attended as part of his civic engagement coursework. The topic was whether the college should increase support for veteran students, including expanded counseling services and academic accommodations for those dealing with PTSD. Jake stood up to address the assembly. "I think we need to be careful about throwing money at problems that might not exist. How do we even verify someone's military service? Anyone can claim they were a war hero." Several students nodded in agreement. Marcus felt his chest tighten as Jake continued his speech. My research shows that a significant percentage of people claiming military service either never served or greatly exaggerate their roles. We shouldn't waste resources on fake veterans when real students need help. Marcus stood up slowly. The room fell silent as he walked to the microphone. He was not known for speaking in public forums, preferring to keep a low profile. I'd like to respond to those comments, Marcus said quietly into the microphone. Jake crossed his arms and leaned back in his chair with a smug expression. Military service is not something people typically lie about for personal gain, Marcus began. The benefits are modest and the scrutiny is intense. Most veterans prefer not to discuss their service in detail because civilian society often doesn't understand or appreciate the sacrifices involved. Anyone can say that, Jake interrupted. Where's your proof? Show us your medals, your deployment records. Talk is cheap. Marcus felt the familiar surge of anger that he had learned to control through years of training and therapy. The auditorium was completely silent now, with over 200 students watching the exchange. Military records are often classified, especially for special operations personnel, Marcus replied evenly. We don't carry around proof of our service like a driver's license. Jake laughed mockingly. Special operations? Let me guess, you were Navy SEAL? Delta Force. Everyone claims to be special forces these days. The room erupted in murmurs and whispers. Marcus could see doubt creeping into the faces of students who had previously respected him. His professors looked uncomfortable, unsure how to handle the situation. As a matter of fact, yes. I served 15 years with the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, Marcus said clearly. The laughter from Jake's supporters grew louder. Someone in the back shouted, "Prove it!" Marcus looked around the room at the faces of his classmates and professors. These were people he had grown to respect and care about over the past 2 years. Now they were looking at him with suspicion and doubt. Dr. Wells stood up from her seat in the faculty section. Perhaps we should move on to other business, she suggested diplomatically. But Jake wasn't finished. No, I think this is exactly the kind of thing we need to address. This is why I oppose expanded veteran benefits. We're being scammed by people who watch too many war movies. Marcus felt something break inside him. For 2 years, he had kept his head down, worked hard, and tried to fit in. He had endured countless small slights and ignorant comments about military service. But this public humiliation, in front of people whose opinions mattered to him, was too much. Without another word, Marcus turned and walked out of the auditorium. Behind him, he could hear Jake addressing the crowd again, his voice full of satisfied triumph. That night, Marcus sat in his dorm room staring at a phone number he hadn't called in over 3 years. The next morning, Marcus woke to find his roommate Tyler packing his belongings into boxes. The young man couldn't meet Marcus's eyes as he folded his clothes and placed them carefully in a suitcase. Moving out? Marcus asked quietly, though he already knew the answer. Tyler paused, his hands gripping a textbook. My parents called last night. They heard about what happened at the meeting from someone who was there. They think it's better if I find a new roommate. Marcus nodded slowly. He had expected this. Jake's parents? Yeah, his dad knows my dad through business. He said you might be unstable, that fake veterans sometimes have mental problems. Tyler finally looked up, his face flushed with embarrassment. I'm sorry, Marcus. I know you're a good guy, but my parents pay for my tuition. Within an hour, Tyler was gone, leaving Marcus alone in the double room that now felt enormous and empty. He sat on his narrow bed looking at the space where Tyler's belongings had been. 2 years of careful relationship building destroyed in a single evening. His phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Wells. Marcus, please see me during office hours today. We need to discuss your academic standing. Marcus closed his eyes and rubbed his temples. The headache that had started the night before was getting worse. He recognized the signs of stress building in his system. The same physical responses he had learned to manage during his military service. When he arrived at Dr. Wells's office that afternoon, he found her sitting behind her desk with a stack of papers and a troubled expression. She gestured for him to sit in the chair across from her. Marcus, I want you to know that I've always respected you as a student, she began carefully. Your work is excellent, your insights are valuable, and your conduct has been exemplary. But, Marcus prompted, she sighed heavily. The administration has received several complaints since last night. Students are saying they feel unsafe around you. Parents are calling, demanding action. What kind of action? Dr. Wells looked down at the papers on her desk. They want documentation of your military service. Proof that you are who you claim to be. Some are suggesting that if you can't provide verification, you should be removed from the veteran program. Marcus felt his jaw clench. My service records are classified. Most special operations personnel can't simply request their files for civilian review. I understand that, but the administration is under pressure. Social media has picked up the story. Someone recorded parts of last night's meeting and posted it online. It's getting a lot of attention. Marcus pulled out his phone and quickly searched for videos from the college. He found 3 different posts from the student government meeting, each showing his confrontation with Jake. The comments were overwhelmingly negative, with people calling him a fraud, a liar, and worse. This is insane, Marcus muttered, scrolling through the harsh comments. Since when do veterans have to prove their service to attend college? It's not about attending college, Dr. Wells said gently. It's about the veteran benefits you're receiving. The administration needs to ensure those benefits are going to legitimate recipients. Marcus looked up from his phone. Are you serious? They think I've been running a 2-year con game to get what amounts to tuition assistance and a small monthly stipend? I know it sounds ridiculous when you put it that way, but the pressure is mounting. The local news has picked up the story. Jake's father apparently has connections in the media. That evening, Marcus watched the local news in his empty dorm room. The story was the lead segment, with a reporter standing outside the college administration building. Tonight, questions are being raised about veteran benefit fraud at the local college, the reporter announced. A student claiming to be a former Delta Force operative has been unable to provide documentation of his military service, leading to concerns about the integrity of the Veteran Assistance Program. The segment included an interview with Jake, who spoke passionately about protecting resources for real veterans and preventing fraud. His father, a successful businessman, appeared on camera to discuss the importance of verification and accountability. We support our veterans 100%, the elder Jake stated firmly, but we also have a responsibility to ensure that programs designed to help those who served our country aren't being abused by people seeking to take advantage of the system. The reporter concluded by noting that the college administration was reviewing the situation and would make a determination about the student's status within the week. Marcus turned off the television and sat in silence. His phone had been buzzing constantly with calls from reporters, but he had ignored them all. What could he say? That his service was so classified he couldn't prove it existed? That some of his missions were so sensitive they would never appear in any public record? He opened his laptop and began researching his options. Through official military channels, it could take months or even years to get any kind of documentation about Special Operations Service. The nature of Delta Force meant that much of his record would remain classified indefinitely. 3 days later, Marcus received a formal letter from the college administration. The language was diplomatic, but the message was clear. Unless he could provide adequate documentation of his military service within 1 week, his veteran benefits would be suspended, and his enrollment status would be reviewed. The letter also informed him that his presentation for Dr. Wells's class had been canceled, and he would need to complete an alternative assignment that didn't involve discussing military service. Marcus crumpled the letter and threw it across his room. 15 years of his life, multiple deployments, friends lost in combat, wounds both physical and psychological that would never fully heal, and now he was being treated like a criminal by an institution he had served to protect. He walked across campus to the Veteran Student Center, a small building that provided resources and support for former military personnel. Inside, he found Sarah Martinez, the counselor who ran the program. She was a former Navy officer who had transitioned to social work after her military service. "Marcus, I heard about what happened," Sarah said as soon as she saw him. "This whole situation is getting out of hand." "They want me to prove my service," Marcus said, slumping into a chair across from her desk. "How am I supposed to do that when half my record is classified?" Sarah pulled out a thick folder. "I've been making some calls. There are ways to verify Special Operations Service, but they take time and require going through proper channels. The problem is the administration wants answers now, because of the media attention." "Exactly. They're more concerned about their reputation than about doing the right thing." Sarah leaned forward. "Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me." Marcus met her eyes. "Go ahead," Is there any way to contact someone from your old unit? Someone who could vouch for you while we work through the official channels? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. The number he had stared at 3 nights ago belonged to his former commanding officer, Colonel James Morrison. Morrison was now stationed at Fort Bragg, working in a training capacity. They had served together for over a decade, but Marcus had deliberately cut contact with his military life when he left the service. Maybe, Marcus said finally, but I'm not sure I want to drag other people into this mess. Think about it, Sarah urged. Your academic career is on the line. More than that, this is becoming a public questioning of your honor and integrity. That's not something you should have to endure alone. That night, Marcus walked around the campus quad, thinking about Sarah's words. The area was mostly empty except for a few students hurrying between buildings. He had grown to love this place over the past 2 years. The quiet academic atmosphere was so different from the intensity of military life, but he had found peace here. Now that peace was shattered, students whispered when they saw him. Professors looked uncomfortable during his classes. He had gone from being a respected older student to being the subject of gossip and suspicion. He pulled out his phone and stared at Colonel Morrison's number. With a deep breath, he pressed call. The phone rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. Morrison here. Colonel, it's Marcus Thompson. There was a pause. Thompson? I'll be damned. How are you, soldier? I've been better, sir. I need to ask you for a favor. Marcus explained the situation, feeling embarrassed and frustrated as he described how his integrity was being questioned by college students and administrators. Colonel Morrison listened without interruption. When Marcus finished, there was a long silence. Son, Morrison said finally, his voice carrying the authority that Marcus remembered from their years together. Nobody questions the honor of one of my soldiers. Nobody. Give me the details of who I need to talk to. Marcus felt a weight lift from his shoulders for the first time in days. Sir, I appreciate that, but this has become a big mess. Media attention, social pressure. I don't want to create problems for you. Marcus, you spent 15 years putting your life on the line for this country. You earned every benefit you're receiving and more. If some college administrator thinks they can intimidate a Delta Force veteran, they're about to learn otherwise. Marcus looked out over the audience, his weathered hands gripping the sides of the podium lightly. The young SEALs in the front row were hanging on his every word now, their earlier bravado replaced by genuine attention and respect. When I graduated from SEAL training 28 years ago, I thought I knew everything I needed to know about being a warrior, Marcus began. I was in the best physical shape of my life. I could shoot accurately, swim for miles, and handle any piece of equipment they gave me. I thought that made me ready for anything. He smiled slightly, remembering his younger self. What I didn't understand then was that being a SEAL isn't just about individual capability. It's about being part of something much bigger than yourself, and that lesson can only be learned through experience. Jake Morrison found himself leaning forward in his seat, completely focused on Marcus's words. The shame he felt about his earlier comments was gradually being replaced by curiosity about what this experienced warrior wanted to share with them. My first deployment was to the Persian Gulf in 1998, Marcus continued. I was assigned to a team of 8 SEALs, and I was the youngest and least experienced member. I was eager to prove myself, maybe too eager. The audience was completely silent now. Even the families in the back rows were listening intently to this man's story. Our team leader was a guy named Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez. He was about 40 years old, which seemed ancient to me at the time, Marcus said with a slight chuckle. Rodriguez had been a SEAL for almost 20 years, and he had this quiet way of handling situations that I didn't appreciate back then. Marcus paused, gathering his thoughts. We were tasked with a reconnaissance mission along the Iranian coast. Nothing too complicated, just gathering intelligence on enemy positions and reporting back to command. I figured it would be straightforward. Ryan Collins was completely absorbed in the story, trying to imagine what it would be like to face his first real mission as a SEAL. Everything went wrong from the beginning, Marcus said. Our insertion boat developed engine problems halfway to the target. We had to swim the last 2 miles to shore in rough seas. By the time we reached land, we were already behind schedule and exhausted. He looked directly at the graduating SEALs. When things started going bad, my first instinct was to push harder, move faster, try to make up for lost time. I wanted to prove that I could handle anything they threw at me. Tony Martinez nodded slightly, recognizing that same eager attitude in himself. But Chief Rodriguez made a decision that frustrated me at the time. Marcus continued. Instead of rushing to complete the mission, he called for a team meeting. Right there on the beach, with enemy territory all around us, he wanted to talk. Marcus smiled at the memory. I thought he was wasting precious time. Here we were, behind schedule and in dangerous territory, and he wanted to have a discussion. I was ready to charge ahead and get the job done. The audience waited quietly for him to continue. Rodriguez looked at each of us and said something I'll never forget. He said, "Gentlemen, we have two choices. We can rush this mission and maybe get lucky, or we can take the time to do it right and make sure everyone goes home safely." Marcus paused, letting that sink in. Then he said, "The mission is important, but not more important than the men standing next to you. We succeed together or not at all." Jake Morrison felt a chill run down his spine. Those words carried weight that went far beyond the simple story Marcus was telling. "We spent 15 minutes on that beach going over every detail of our plan," Marcus said. Rodriguez made sure each team member understood not just their own role, but everyone else's role too. He asked questions, listened to suggestions, and made adjustments based on input from the entire team. The young SEALs were completely engaged now, understanding that this wasn't just a war story but a lesson in leadership and teamwork. When we finally moved out, everything was different, Marcus continued. Instead of 8 individuals trying to complete a mission, we were a single unit working together. Each person knew exactly what the others were doing at all times. Marcus's voice grew more serious. That night we encountered an enemy patrol that wasn't supposed to be in the area. If we had been rushing around individually, trying to prove ourselves, someone would have been caught or killed. The ceremony area was so quiet that the only sounds were the distant waves and the occasional call of seagulls overhead, but because we had taken the time to prepare properly, because we were working as a true team, we were able to avoid detection and complete our mission successfully, Marcus said. More importantly, all 8 of us made it home safely. He looked at each of the young graduates in turn. That mission taught me something that no amount of training could have prepared me for. Being a SEAL isn't about being the toughest, fastest, or strongest individual. It's about being someone your teammates can count on completely. Ryan Collins found himself thinking about his own teammates, the men he had trained with for months. He realized that despite all their individual achievements, they were about to face challenges that would require them to work together in ways they had never experienced. Over the next 12 years, I served with dozens of different SEALs, Marcus continued. Some were incredible athletes. Some were brilliant tacticians. Some were natural leaders. But the ones I trusted most, the ones I wanted beside me when things got dangerous, were the ones who understood that our strength came from working together. Marcus stepped out from behind the podium slightly, making his presence more personal and direct. Chief Rodriguez taught me that leadership isn't about giving orders or proving how tough you are, he said. Real leadership is about taking care of your people, making sure everyone has what they need to succeed, and creating an environment where the team can accomplish things that no individual could do alone. Tony Martinez thought about the instructors who had pushed him through training, realizing now that their harsh criticism and demanding standards had been preparing him for exactly this kind of responsibility. When I became a team leader myself, I tried to follow Rodriguez's example, Marcus said. I learned that the most important part of any mission isn't the planning or the equipment, or even the courage of individual team members. It's the trust that each person has in everyone else. The graduating SEALs were beginning to understand that their real education was just beginning. Everything they had learned at Coronado was preparation for lessons that could only be learned through experience and service alongside other warriors. Word about what happened in Judge Reynolds's courtroom spread quickly through the courthouse and then throughout the city. By the end of the day, the local newspaper had picked up the story. By the next morning, it was being talked about on radio stations across the state. The story had everything people loved: a humble hero, an arrogant judge who learned a hard lesson, and a reminder that you never know who you're talking to. But more importantly, it sparked conversations about how veterans were treated and how people in positions of power sometimes forgot to show basic respect, Judge. Reynolds arrived at work the next day to find her office filled with flowers, letters, and phone messages. Most of them were positive, praising her for admitting her mistake and apologizing to Captain Patterson. But some were critical, questioning whether she was fit to serve as a judge if she could so badly misjudge someone's character. She read every letter and listened to every message. She knew she deserved both the praise for doing the right thing and the criticism for making such a serious error in the first place. Meanwhile, Captain Patterson was dealing with attention he had never wanted. Reporters were calling his home asking for interviews. Veterans organizations wanted him to speak at their events. People were calling him a hero all over again, which made him deeply uncomfortable. Admiral Mitchell stopped by Patterson's house that evening to check on his friend. "I hope you're not angry with me for speaking up," Admiral Mitchell said as they sat on Patterson's back porch, drinking coffee. "No, Bob," Patterson replied. "I understand why you did it. But you know how I feel about all this attention. I know you do. But Jim, sometimes people need to be reminded of what real service looks like. That judge learned something important yesterday, and so did everyone else in that courtroom." Patterson sipped his coffee and looked out at his small, neat backyard. He had never been comfortable with praise even when it was well-deserved. "The thing is," he said after a while, "I didn't fight that parking ticket because I wanted recognition. I fought it because it was wrong. If that meter was broken, then other people probably got unfair tickets too." Admiral Mitchell smiled. "That's exactly why I had to speak up. You were more concerned about fairness for everyone than about how you were being treated." The next week, the city followed through on Judge Reynolds' order to inspect all the downtown parking meters. They found that 12 of them were malfunctioning in various ways. Some had broken displays, others had timing mechanisms that were running fast or slow, and one had been giving people tickets even when they had paid. The city not only fixed all the broken meters but also refunded money to everyone who had received tickets from them in the previous 6 months. The total cost was over $50,000, but the mayor said it was the right thing to do. Judge Reynolds used the incident as a learning experience. She started a new practice in her courtroom of actually listening to people's evidence before making judgments about their cases. She also began speaking to law students about the importance of treating everyone with respect, regardless of how they looked or what kind of case they were presenting. "That day changed how I approach my job," she would tell the students. "I realized that I had started thinking of people as cases rather than as human beings. Captain Patterson reminded me that everyone who comes into my courtroom deserves to be heard." The story also had an impact on how the city handled complaints about government equipment. They established a new system where people could report broken meters online, and maintenance crews were required to respond within 24 hours. They also put up signs next to any meter that was out of order, so people wouldn't get tickets while it was being repaired. Captain Patterson received hundreds of letters from veterans and active-duty military personnel who had been inspired by his story. Many of them shared their own experiences of being dismissed or disrespected by people who didn't know about their service. One letter particularly moved him. It was from a young Marine who had been struggling with depression after returning from overseas. The Marine wrote that reading about Captain Patterson's dignity in the face of disrespect had reminded him that his service meant something, even when other people didn't recognize it. Patterson wrote back to every single letter he received, just as he had always done. He never considered himself special, but he understood that sometimes people needed to hear from someone who had been through similar experiences. The incident also brought Admiral Mitchell and Captain Patterson closer together. They had served together years ago but had lost touch after retirement. The courtroom confrontation reminded them both of the bonds they had formed during their military service. "You know what I learned from all this?" Admiral Mitchell said during one of their weekly coffee meetings. "What's that?" "I learned that heroes don't always look like heroes. They don't always announce themselves or demand recognition. Sometimes they just quietly do the right thing, even when it's difficult." Patterson laughed. "Bob, you're getting sentimental in your old age. Maybe I am, but I'm also right." As the weeks passed, the intensity of the media attention died down, which suited Captain Patterson perfectly. He went back to his quiet life of volunteering and helping other veterans. But the impact of what had happened in that courtroom continued to ripple outward. Judge Reynolds became known as one of the fairest judges in the city. The new parking meter inspection system prevented hundreds of unfair tickets, and Captain Patterson's example of quiet dignity inspired countless people who heard his story. But perhaps the most important change was in how people thought about making assumptions about others. The story became a reminder that everyone has a story, and that respect should be given freely, not earned through titles or recognition. The courtroom was so quiet that people could hear their own heartbeats. Admiral Mitchell stood tall and proud, looking directly at Judge Reynolds as he prepared to reveal the truth about the man she had been mocking. "Your Honor," Admiral Mitchell said, his voice strong and clear, "the man you have been insulting and dismissing is Captain James Patterson, United States Navy, retired, but that title doesn't begin to tell you who he really is." Judge Reynolds felt her mouth go dry, but Admiral Mitchell was just getting started. "Captain Patterson served his country for 35 years, the Admiral continued. "He commanded nuclear submarines during some of the most dangerous missions in our nation's history. During the Cold War, he spent months underwater, protecting American interests while risking his life every single day." Mr. Patterson remained perfectly still, but those who were watching closely could see a slight flush of embarrassment on his face. He had never been comfortable with praise or attention, even when it was well-deserved. "But that's not all," Admiral Mitchell went on. "Captain Patterson was awarded the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism during a classified mission that I still can't talk about in public. What I can tell you is that his actions saved the lives of hundreds of American servicemen and prevented an international incident that could have started a war." The people in the courtroom were staring openly now. Some of them had their mouths hanging open. The prosecutor, Sarah Chen, was looking back and forth between Mr. Patterson and the Admiral, like she was watching a tennis match. Judge Reynolds tried to interrupt. "Admiral, I'm not finished, Your Honor," Admiral Mitchell said firmly. "Captain Patterson also received the Silver Star, the Bronze Star with Valor, and 3 Purple Hearts for wounds received in combat. He served in Vietnam, the Persian Gulf, and in operations that most people will never know about because they're still classified." Mr. Patterson finally spoke up, his voice quiet but clear. "Admiral Mitchell, please. This isn't necessary." "Oh, but it is necessary, Jim," Admiral Mitchell replied, using his friend's first name, "because this judge needs to understand exactly who she's been talking to." Judge Reynolds was starting to realize that she had made a terrible mistake. But Admiral Mitchell wasn't done destroying her assumptions. "After Captain Patterson retired from active duty," he continued, "did he sit around complaining about parking tickets? No. He spent 10 years working with veterans who were struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder. He helped dozens of former soldiers and sailors get back on their feet and find purpose in their lives again." The Admiral paused to let that sink in, then continued. "He also volunteered at homeless shelters, worked with inner-city youth programs, and donated more money to military charities than most people make in a year. And he did all of this quietly, without any publicity or recognition, because that's the kind of man he is." Judge Reynolds was looking pale now. She was beginning to understand the magnitude of her error. But Admiral Mitchell still had more to reveal. "Captain Patterson received the Presidential Unit Citation, the Navy Unit Commendation, and the Meritorious Service Medal," he said. "He was personally decorated by 3 different presidents for his service to his country." The courtroom was so silent that when someone in the back row shifted in their seat, it sounded like thunder. "But perhaps most importantly," Admiral Mitchell continued, "Captain Patterson is the kind of man who would never use any of these honors to get special treatment. He came to this court today not as a decorated war hero, but as a citizen who believed he had been treated unfairly. He was willing to stand here and be insulted rather than reveal who he was because he believes that everyone should be equal under the law." Mr. Patterson looked down at his hands, clearly uncomfortable with being the center of attention. "Your Honor," Admiral Mitchell said, his voice taking on a harder edge, "you said that Captain Patterson probably thinks he's above the law and that the world owes him something. Let me tell you what the world actually owes him." Judge Reynolds wanted to disappear into her chair, but she couldn't look away from the Admiral's stern gaze. "The world owes Captain Patterson the freedom you enjoy every day. The world owes him the peace that allows you to sleep safely in your bed at night. The world owes him the liberty that lets you sit in that judge's chair and speak your mind without fear." The Admiral's words were hitting Judge Reynolds like physical blows. Every word he spoke made her feel smaller and more ashamed. "And what does Captain Patterson ask for in return for his decades of service and sacrifice?" Admiral Mitchell asked. "Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Except maybe for a parking meter to work properly. and for people to listen when he presents evidence instead of mocking him. Sarah Chen, the prosecutor, was frantically flipping through papers in her file. She had suddenly realized that she needed to take this case much more seriously than she had planned. "Your Honor," she said quietly, "I'd like to request a brief recess to review the evidence Mr. Patterson has provided." But Judge Reynolds was too shocked to respond immediately. She was staring at Mr. Patterson with a completely different expression than she had worn just minutes before. Admiral Mitchell could see that his words were having the intended effect, but he had one more thing to say. "Captain Patterson never told you any of this because he doesn't think his service should get him special treatment," he said. "But, Your Honor, with all due respect, there's a difference between special treatment and basic respect. And the man standing at that table has earned more respect than almost anyone in this courtroom will ever understand." The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. Judge Reynolds sat frozen behind her bench, trying to process what she had just learned. Mr. Patterson stood quietly at the defendant's table, probably wishing he could be anywhere else in the world. Finally, Judge Reynolds found her voice, though it was much quieter and more uncertain than it had been before. "Captain Patterson," she said, the title sounding strange in her mouth after what she had been saying earlier. I think we need to take a closer look at your evidence." Admiral Robert Mitchell sat in the back of the courtroom, barely believing what he was witnessing. He had known James Patterson for over 20 years, and watching him being treated this way made his blood boil. But he also knew Patterson well enough to understand why the man wasn't defending himself or revealing who he really was. Judge Reynolds was still enjoying herself at the defendant's expense. She leaned back in her chair and looked down at Mr. Patterson like he was something unpleasant she had found on her shoe. "You know what I think, Mr. Patterson," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "I think you're one of those people who watches too much TV and thinks every little traffic violation is some kind of conspiracy against you. You probably think the whole world owes you something." Mr. Patterson remained silent, which only seemed to encourage the judge to continue her verbal assault. "I bet you're retired and have nothing better to do than waste the court's time with your silly theories about broken parking meters," she went on. "Maybe you should find a hobby instead of bothering hardworking public servants with your complaints." The prosecutor, a young woman named Sarah Chen, looked uncomfortable. She had expected this to be a simple case where the defendant would either pay the fine or provide some evidence about the meter. Instead, it had turned into a one-sided attack by the judge. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said hesitantly, "perhaps we should look at the evidence Mr. Patterson mentioned?" Judge Reynolds waved her hand dismissively. "Ms. Chen, don't encourage him. If we looked at everyone's so-called evidence about parking meters, we'd be here all day. The meter was working fine. If it wasn't, the city would have fixed it." Mr. Patterson finally spoke up again. "Your Honor, I have maintenance records showing that this particular meter had been reported as malfunctioning multiple times before my citation." "Maintenance records?" Judge Reynolds laughed. "Where did you get those? Did you file a Freedom of Information Act request for a parking ticket?" "Mr. Patterson, you're taking this way too seriously." What the judge didn't know was that Mr. Patterson had indeed filed the proper requests to get those records. It wasn't because he cared about $50. He could easily afford the fine. It was because he believed in fairness and doing things the right way. These were values that had guided him throughout his entire career. "Your Honor," Mr. Patterson said patiently, "I believe that government equipment should work properly if people are expected to follow the rules. If a parking meter can't tell someone when their time is up, how can they be fairly penalized?" "Oh, spare me the civics lesson," Judge Reynolds replied. "You're not some constitutional scholar, Mr. Patterson. You're just another person trying to get out of paying a fine." Admiral Mitchell had heard enough. He could see that Patterson wasn't going to defend himself, even though he was being humiliated in front of a room full of strangers. That was just the kind of man Patterson was. He never used his position or reputation to get special treatment. But watching a respected hero being mocked by someone who had no idea what she was doing was more than the Admiral could bear. He stood up from his seat in the back row, his movement causing several people to turn and look. Judge Reynolds noticed the disturbance and looked toward the back of the courtroom with annoyance. "Sir, please sit down. We're in the middle of proceedings here." Admiral Mitchell was wearing civilian clothes, but everything about the way he carried himself screamed military. He was tall and broad-shouldered with steel gray hair, and the kind of bearing that came from decades of commanding respect. "Your Honor, I apologize for the interruption," he said in a clear, strong voice that carried easily through the courtroom, "but I feel I need to speak." "Well, you can't," Judge Reynolds snapped. "This isn't your case, and you have no business interrupting. Sit down or I'll have you removed from my courtroom." Admiral Mitchell didn't sit down. Instead, he took a step forward. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I think you should know who you're talking to." Judge Reynolds was getting angry now. First, she had to deal with a stubborn defendant who wouldn't just pay his ticket, and now some stranger was trying to interrupt her proceedings. "I don't care who he is," she said loudly. "He could be the President of the United States for all I care. In my courtroom, everyone gets treated the same way." The irony of her words would become clear very soon. But at that moment, Judge Reynolds was too angry to realize what she had just said. "Sit down right now, or I'll hold you in contempt of court," she warned the Admiral. Admiral Mitchell looked at Mr. Patterson, who gave him the slightest shake of his head. Patterson still didn't want special treatment even now. He was willing to let the judge continue making a fool of herself, rather than use his reputation to win a case. But Admiral Mitchell had made his decision. Some things were more important than one man's modesty. "Your Honor," he said firmly, "I am Admiral Robert Mitchell of the United States Navy, and I cannot sit here and watch you disrespect one of the finest Americans I have ever had the honor to know." The courtroom went completely silent. Even Judge Reynolds stopped talking, though she didn't look impressed by the Admiral's introduction. "I don't care if you're an admiral or a janitor," she said, though her voice was a little less confident than before. "You have no right to interrupt these proceedings." Admiral Mitchell smiled grimly. "Your Honor, you said you don't care if the defendant is the President of the United States. Well, you're about to find out just how wrong you can be about someone." He turned to look directly at Mr. Patterson, who was still standing quietly at the defendant's table. "Ladies and gentlemen," Admiral Mitchell said, his voice carrying to every corner of the courtroom, "allow me to introduce you to the man this judge has been mocking for the past 10 minutes. Judge Reynolds opened her mouth to stop him, but something in the Admiral's tone made her hesitate. "The man standing at that table," Admiral Mitchell continued, "is not just any retiree with too much time on his hands. He is not just another person trying to get out of a parking ticket." The tension in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Everyone was staring at Mr. Patterson, who stood exactly as he had before, calm, dignified, and quiet. Admiral Mitchell took a deep breath and prepared to reveal the truth that would change everything.